Arthur, who are you messaging? The man you said would always come. No, my friend. He may not remember us. Then I'll remind him.
The rain hit the window like fists. Delphine Ashworth pressed her back against the cracked plaster wall of the narrow hallway, one hand clamped over her daughter's mouth, the other trembling around the handle of a kitchen knife she prayed she'd never have to use. Downstairs, glass shattered. A chair scraped violently across the floor. And then came the sound she feared most in the entire world. Her husband's voice, low and slurred and full of a rage that had no bottom. "Delphine, where are you hiding, you ungrateful little—" 6-year-old Winifred's eyes were huge and wet in the dark, her small body shaking against her mother's legs. She didn't cry. She had learned in her 6 short years that crying only made things louder, made things worse. She had learned to be silent the way other children learn nursery rhymes. Delphine's mind raced through every door, every window, every possible escape, and found none. The cottage was small, the night was black, and the man downstairs, Reginald Cross, had already broken 2 of her ribs 8 months ago and told the physician she'd fallen down the cellar stairs. Nobody believed the truth. Nobody wanted to, because Reginald Cross smiled beautifully in public, bowed elegantly to the right people, and wore his charm like armor. The footsteps on the stairs grew heavier. Winifred moved first. While her mother stood frozen with the knife shaking in her fist, the little girl reached into the pocket of her nightgown. The old cracked mobile phone her mother kept hidden for emergencies. The one number saved beneath a name only the 2 of them knew. The Duke. Her small thumbs moved fast, faster than fear, faster than the footsteps climbing toward them. "He's beating Mama, please come, she's bleeding, I am scared." She hit send just as the door burst open. 3 miles away in the golden marble grandeur of Ravensmoor Hall, Duke Raphael Ravensmoor stood beneath a chandelier the size of a carriage, surrounded by lords, ladies, and the particular suffocation of a ball he had never wanted to attend. He was, by every account whispered behind fans and wine glasses, the most eligible and most unreachable man in the kingdom. 6 years a widower in matters of the heart, if not the law. 6 years since scandal had carved his name into cold marble and left him unwilling to trust another soul with anything softer than duty. He was mid-sentence, offering some diplomatic nothing to the Earl of Camden, when his phone buzzed once in his breast pocket. He almost ignored it. Almost. Something, some old instinct he couldn't name, some thread that had connected him to a woman he hadn't seen in over a year, made him excuse himself and glance down. The words hit him like a blade between the ribs. "He's beating Mama, please come, she's bleeding, I am." Scared, the wine glass slipped from his fingers and shattered against the marble floor. Every head in the ballroom turned. The Earl of Camden said something, his name, a question, concern, but Raphael didn't hear a syllable of it. He was already moving. "Get my car," he snapped at the nearest footman, voice cutting through the music like a blade through silk. "Now." "Your Grace, the ambassador is expecting your address in now." He didn't run. Dukes did not run, not in public, not ever. But his stride ate the ballroom floor in strides so fast that his coat billowed behind him like something out of the old war paintings that lined the East Corridor. Behind him, a ripple of scandalized whispers began, the kind that would be dinner conversation across the capital by morning. He didn't care. Because 3 years ago, in a rain-soaked alley behind a charity gala, a young widow named Delphine had pulled a drowning stranger from the edge of a canal without knowing, or caring, that he was the Duke of Ravensmoor. She had bandaged his hand with strips torn from her own dress, and told him quite fiercely that titles didn't make a man worth saving, character did. He had never forgotten her, had watched, from a careful and cowardly distance, as she married another man, a man who smiled at parties and, apparently, broke ribs in private. He had told himself it wasn't his business. He had been wrong. The rain lashed the windshield as his driver took the coastal road at a speed that would have terrified anyone else in the car. Raphael said nothing, his jaw a hard line, his hands fisted so tightly in his lap that his knuckles had gone white as bone. "Please, God, let me be on time." He hadn't prayed in 6 years. He prayed now, silently, desperately, the same 3 words, over and over like a man drowning and grasping for driftwood. The cottage came into view, small, crooked, its single porch light flickering weakly against the storm. And even through the rain, even through the glass, he could hear it, screaming. He was out of the car before it fully stopped, sprinting across the muddy yard, boots sinking into the earth, coat soaked through in seconds. He didn't knock. He didn't announce himself. He put his shoulder into the door, and it gave way with a splintering crack. The scene inside would carve itself into his memory forever. Delphine on the floor, one arm raised protectively over her face, blood at her temple, her dress torn at the shoulder. Reginald standing over her, hand raised for another blow, his face twisted with the particular cruelty of a man who had never once feared consequence. And in the corner, pressed against the wall, small and silent and shaking, Winifred, still clutching the phone she had used to summon a stranger she had only ever heard stories about. A duke from her mother's whispered bedtime tales. A man she'd never met but had somehow, impossibly, trusted with the truth. Reginald. Raphael's voice was quiet. That was the terrifying part. It was quiet. Reginald spun, and whatever drunken bravado had fueled him moments before drained instantly from his face, when he registered exactly who stood in the doorway. Rain dripping from his hair, eyes the color of storm-dark slate. "Your Grace, this is a family matter. Step away from her. You don't understand." Raphael crossed the room in 4 strides, and Reginald found himself lifted bodily by the collar, slammed against the wall hard enough to rattle the framed photographs hanging there. For a man known throughout the capital for his icy composure, for his careful diplomatic restraint, the Duke's control in that moment hung by a single fraying thread. "If you ever," Raphael said, his voice a low, lethal whisper, "come near her again, if you ever come near that child again, I will make certain the only home you know for the rest of your miserable life has iron bars on the windows. Do you understand me?" Reginald, sobered instantly by terror, nodded frantically. Raphael released him with something like disgust, and the man crumpled to the floor, scrambling backward like a beaten dog. Then, and only then, did the Duke turn. Delphine was pushing herself upright, blood trickling from the cut above her eyebrow, her hands shaking as she reached instinctively for her daughter. And Winifred, brave, silent, extraordinary Winifred, was already running across the room, throwing her small arms around her mother's neck, sobbing now that the danger had finally passed. Raphael knelt beside them, his usual composure entirely abandoned, his hands hovering uncertainly, as though he wasn't sure he had the right to touch her. "Delphine," her name came out rough, cracked, nothing like the polished tones he used in Parliament or at state dinners. "Delphine, look at me. Are you—" "I'm fine," she whispered, though the tremor in her voice betrayed the lie. "I'm fine, how did you—" Her eyes found her daughter's phone, still clutched in small fingers, and something in her face broke, relief and horror and gratitude all crashing together at once. "Winnie," she breathed. "Oh, my darling girl." "I texted him, Mama," Winifred whispered. "You said if it was really, really bad, I could. You said he was safe." Delphine looked up at Raphael then, really looked at him, for the first time in over a year. Rain-soaked, ruined tuxedo. Knuckles scraped raw. A duke who had abandoned a state dinner, humiliated himself in front of half the aristocracy, and driven through a storm at breakneck speed. For her. "You came," she whispered. "I will always come," Raphael said, and the words left him before he could stop them, before he could weigh their weight or their danger. "Every single time. Do you understand me? Every time." Behind them, Reginald let out a bitter, broken laugh from where he still sat crumpled against the wall. "How touching," he sneered, some of his cruelty returning now that the immediate threat had passed. "The great Duke of Ravensmoor riding to the rescue of another man's wife. Tell me, Your Grace, does the palace know you're slumming it in cottages tonight? Does the king know his favorite nephew is playing hero for a woman who isn't even—" "Say another word," Raphael said without even turning his head, "and I will reconsider my restraint." Reginald wisely fell silent. Raphael turned back to Delphine, gentler now, his hand finally settling, carefully, as though she might shatter, against her uninjured shoulder. "You're coming with me, both of you, tonight. Raphael, I can't just—" "You can. You will. I am not asking as a request, Delphine. I am telling you as a fact. You are not staying in this house for another hour." For a long moment, she searched his face, and he let her see whatever she needed to see, the desperation, the fear that had nearly swallowed him whole on that drive through the storm, the 6 years of carefully buried feeling he had never once allowed himself to examine too closely. Finally, she nodded. It was, though neither of them could have known it in that rain-soaked moment, the first step of a journey that would upend a kingdom, expose secrets buried for a decade, and force a duke who had sworn never to love again to choose between the crown on his head and the woman kneeling in the wreckage of her old life. The car ride back to Ravensmoor Hall passed in near silence, broken only by the storm outside and Winifred's soft, exhausted breathing as she finally slept against her mother's side, wrapped in Raphael's own coat. Delphine sat rigid, staring out at the passing darkness, one hand pressed to the bandage a palace physician, summoned by a single terse phone call, would soon replace properly. She could feel Raphael's eyes on her more than once, though he said nothing, offering no explanation for the 6 terrible years since they'd last spoken more than pleasantries at a mutual acquaintance's funeral. "You don't owe me anything," she finally said, voice barely above a whisper. "For coming, you don't owe. Stop." The word came out harder than he intended, and he softened it instantly. "Stop apologizing for existing, Delphine. You called for help. I came. That is the entire transaction. There is no debt. It's not that simple. It is exactly that simple." He turned to look at her fully then, and something in his gaze made her breath catch despite the exhaustion, the pain, the terror still humming beneath her skin. "You saved my life once. Do you remember that? A canal, a gala, a woman who had no idea who I was and pulled me out anyway, because she couldn't stand to watch a stranger drown. That was different. It was not different. It was exactly the same. Someone was drowning. I came. That is what we do for each other, apparently, whether the world approves or not." She looked away first, unable to hold the weight of his gaze, unable to bear the terrible tenderness in it, because she remembered, too. She remembered every detail of that night, the rain, his hand gripping hers, the way he'd looked at her afterward like she'd handed him something he didn't know he was missing. She married Reginald 4 months later. It had been, she now understood with the clarity that only disaster could provide, the single greatest mistake of her life. Ravensmoor Hall rose out of the storm like something from a fairy tale gone slightly wrong, all soaring stone towers and gold-lit windows, more castle than country house, the ancestral seat of a family whose bloodline stretched back to the founding of the kingdom itself. Delphine had seen it before, from a distance, on the rare occasions her old life had brushed against the aristocracy's glittering edges. She had never imagined she would arrive at its gates in the dead of night, bleeding, broken, carrying a sleeping child in her arms. Staff appeared instantly, summoned by some silent signal Raphael must have sent ahead. A physician, a housekeeper with warm blankets and warmer eyes, a room prepared, 2 rooms, adjoining, with a fire already crackling in the hearth as though the household had been expecting exactly this arrival for years. "You'll stay here," Raphael said, standing in the doorway of the guest wing while the physician tended to the cut above Delphine's eyebrow. "For as long as you need. There is no argument to be had on this matter. Raphael, the scandal alone. Let them talk." His jaw tightened. "I have spent 6 years letting them talk about everything else. I find I have very little patience left for caring what they think of this." Something in his tone made her look up sharply, made the physician pause mid-stitch, made even the fire seem to hold its breath. But before she could ask what he meant, before she could untangle the layers beneath his words, a soft knock interrupted them. The housekeeper, an older woman with silver hair and kind eyes named Mrs. Pemberton, stood in the doorway with an expression Delphine couldn't quite read. "Your Grace," she said carefully, "Lady Cerelia has arrived. She's asking for you," rather insistently. Raphael's entire posture changed, shoulders squaring, jaw setting, the warmth that had briefly softened his features vanishing behind something colder, more practiced. "Tell her I'll be down shortly. She's already on her way up, Your Grace." As if summoned by the very mention of her name, a woman appeared in the hallway behind Mrs. Pemberton, tall, striking, dressed in ice-blue silk that probably cost more than Delphine's entire cottage, her dark hair swept into an elaborate style that hadn't wilted a single degree, despite the storm outside. Lady Cerelia Vane moved like she owned every room she entered, because in the circles that mattered, she very nearly did. Her eyes swept the scene, the physician, the bandages, Delphine's torn dress, the sleeping child on the bed, and something sharp and calculating flickered behind her carefully composed features before she smoothed it away into practiced concern. "Raphael, darling, I heard the most alarming things. You abandoned the ambassador mid-toast? The entire ballroom is positively buzzing." Her gaze slid to Delphine again, lingering, assessing. "And who is this?" "Cerelia, this isn't the time, isn't it?" Her smile was all teeth and no warmth. because from where I'm standing it looks like precisely the time for introductions. I am, after all, your intended darling. It seems only fair I know who you're rescuing at midnight instead of finishing your diplomatic obligations." The word hung in the air like a dropped blade. Intended. Delphine felt something cold settle in her chest, though she told herself firmly that it was none of her business, that she had no right to feel anything at all about the woman standing in the doorway with proprietary ease, speaking of engagements and futures that had nothing to do with her. Raphael's expression, however, had gone carefully, dangerously blank. "There has been no formal agreement, Cerelia, as you well know. A formality," she waved a manicured hand dismissively, "that our families have discussed for years. One your uncle the king is rather looking forward to finalizing, I might add, given the instability of the succession lately." Her eyes flicked once more to Delphine, cool and assessing. "But do introduce us. I hate rudeness." Delphine lifted her chin despite the throbbing at her temple, despite the exhaustion pulling at every limb, despite 6 years of instinct telling her to shrink, to disappear, to never draw attention to herself in a room with someone powerful and unpredictable. "Delphine Ashworth," she said clearly, "and I won't be staying long enough to inconvenience your engagement, my lady." Something flickered in Cerelia's eyes, surprise perhaps at the steel beneath the exhaustion, before the mask slid back into place. How delightfully humble. She turned back to Raphael, looping her arm through his with practiced possessiveness. "Do come down when you're finished playing physician's assistant, darling. The ambassador is asking after you, and I'd rather not explain your absence a second time." She swept from the room in a cloud of expensive perfume, leaving silence in her wake. Raphael stood very still for a long moment, and Delphine watched something like guilt, or perhaps regret, pass across his features before he schooled them back into composure. "Delphine, I should explain, you don't owe me any explanations," she said quietly, echoing his own words back to him, though they tasted like ash in her mouth. "You have a fiancé. I have a black eye and a daughter who just watched her stepfather try to kill me. I think we both have more pressing matters than whatever this is. She is not my fiancé, not officially. It's a political arrangement my family has pushed for years, one I have refused to sign for." "Raphael," the physician cleared her throat pointedly. "I need to finish these stitches, Your Grace, if you don't mind." He hesitated at the door, clearly wanting to say more, clearly weighing words that seemed too large and too dangerous for the moment. Finally, he simply nodded once, his eyes lingering on her far longer than propriety would allow, before he turned and disappeared down the corridor to face the ballroom, the ambassador, and the woman who apparently held far more claim to his future than either of them had yet admitted aloud. Delphine closed her eyes as the physician resumed her work, exhaustion and pain, and something dangerously close to heartbreak crashing over her all at once. "This is why I stopped hoping," she told herself firmly. This is exactly why. She did not yet know how wrong, and how right, that thought would prove to be. Morning arrived softer than the night had promised, sunlight filtering gold through tall windows, birdsong replacing the storm's fury. Delphine woke disoriented in unfamiliar sheets, her body aching, her mind slow to catch up at the memory of the night before. The terror, the rescue, the strange and beautiful and complicated man who had upended her entire life in the space of a single desperate phone call. Winifred was already awake, sitting cross-legged on the enormous bed, staring in open wonder at the room around them, the gilded ceiling, the towering windows, the marble fireplace large enough to stand inside. "Mama!" she whispered, eyes wide. "Is this a real castle? Despite everything, despite the ache in her ribs and the deeper ache in her heart?" Delphine found herself smiling. "It certainly looks like one, doesn't it?" A soft knock interrupted them, and Mrs. Pemberton entered with a tray of breakfast, her expression kind and unhurried. "His Grace requests your presence in the East Garden when you're ready, my lady. No rush. Take whatever time you need, my lady." Delphine noted the title with quiet unease. She was no lady. She was a widow's daughter who had married beneath even modest expectations, who had spent the last 3 years learning to disappear inside her own home to avoid a violent man's temper. She did not belong in a place with gilded ceilings and marble fireplaces, and yet, an hour later, dressed in a borrowed gown far finer than anything she owned, she found herself walking through a garden more beautiful than anything she'd ever imagined. Roses climbing ancient stone walls, a fountain singing softly in the morning light, and Raphael standing beneath an archway of white blossoms, looking somehow both entirely at ease and entirely uncertain. An unusual combination for a man who commanded rooms for a living. "You look well rested," he said, and then winced slightly at how absurd the pleasantry sounded given the circumstances. "I look like a woman wearing a very expensive costume," Delphine corrected, though there was no real bite in it. "Raphael, we need to talk about last night, about Reginald. He's not going to simply let this go. A man like that doesn't accept humiliation quietly. And about the woman, Lady Cerelia." Raphael's jaw tightened, but he gestured toward a stone bench beneath the archway, waiting until she'd settled before speaking. "Reginald has been dealt with," he said carefully. "My solicitor visited him this morning with a very persuasive set of documents. He will not be troubling you again, not without facing consequences that would end whatever remains of his reputation and his freedom. You can't simply... I can, actually. That is, occasionally one benefit of the title I inherited and have never particularly wanted." A ghost of dry humor touched his voice before fading. "As for Cerelia, the arrangement between our families is exactly that, an arrangement. My uncle, the king, has pushed for it for political reasons that have nothing to do with affection and everything to do with securing alliances in the Northern Territories. I have refused to sign the formal contract for 3 years running." 3 years. Delphine studied him carefully. "That's a very long refusal for something that isn't important to you." Something flickered across his face. Surprise, perhaps, that she'd caught the contradiction so easily. "It is complicated," he finally admitted. "My uncle is not a patient man, and my refusal has not come without cost. But I find I would rather bear that cost than commit myself to a marriage built on nothing but political convenience." "And last night? Riding through a storm, abandoning a state dinner, humiliating yourself in front of the entire aristocracy. For a woman who is, as far as your world is concerned, entirely beneath your notice?" He turned to look at her then, and the intensity in his gaze made her breath catch despite herself. "Delphine, I have thought of you every single day for 6 years. Do you understand that? Every day since that canal, since you pulled a drowning stranger from the water without knowing or caring who he was, since you looked at me like I was simply a person worth saving rather than a title worth cultivating. I watched you marry another man because I was too much of a coward to speak before it was too late. I have regretted that cowardice every single day since." The garden seemed to hold its breath around them, roses swaying softly in a breeze that suddenly felt far too intimate for the words hanging between them. "Raphael, I am not asking you for anything," he continued quickly, as though afraid to let her interrupt before he'd finished. "I know your wounds are fresh. I know you have a daughter to protect and a life to rebuild and very little reason to trust anything I say after everything you've endured. I am simply telling you the truth, because I have spent 6 years lying to myself about it, and I find I no longer have the patience for that particular deception." Delphine sat very still, her heart hammering against her bruised ribs, 1,000 competing instincts warring inside her. The instinct to run, honed by years of learning that vulnerability led to pain, the instinct to trust, buried but not entirely extinguished by everything Reginald had tried to beat out of her, and beneath both, something warmer and more dangerous than either, something that had apparently been quietly waiting 6 years for exactly this moment. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted softly. "I don't know how to trust someone who wears a title like armor and commands physicians and solicitors with a single phone call. My entire world nearly ended last night, Raphael. I can't simply fall into the arms of a duke because he rescued me from a burning building. That's not how any of this works. I'm not asking you to fall into anything." His voice was gentle now, careful, the voice of a man handling something infinitely precious and infinitely fragile. "I'm asking you to stay, to heal, to let your daughter feel safe for the first time in longer than either of us probably knows. Everything else can wait as long as it needs to wait." Before she could respond, a shout echoed across the garden, Winifred's delighted laughter, chasing a peacock across the lawn with Mrs. Pemberton trailing behind in mild alarm, the enormous bird squawking indignantly as the little girl gave chase with pure, unguarded joy. Delphine realized with an ache that was equal parts beautiful and painful, the first time she had heard her daughter laugh like that in longer than she could remember. "All right," she whispered, watching her daughter's joy with tears suddenly threatening at the corners of her eyes. "We'll stay, for now." Raphael's answering smile was the first genuinely unguarded expression she'd seen cross his face since the night before. Relief and hope and something achingly tender all at once. Neither of them noticed the figure watching from an upper window of the east wing. Lady Cerelia, her expression carved from ice, a phone already pressed to her ear. "It's happening exactly as we feared," she said quietly into the receiver. "Yes, tonight. We will move tonight." The rest of the day passed in strange, fragile peace. Delphine found herself wandering the halls of Ravensmoor with cautious wonder, watching her daughter's laughter echo through corridors that had likely never heard a child's joy in generations. Raphael, despite the mounting pile of state correspondence awaiting his attention, seemed to find endless reasons to appear wherever she happened to be. A suggestion for the garden path, a question about Winifred's favorite foods, an excuse to simply stand near her that neither of them acknowledged aloud. By evening, something had shifted between them. Not quite named, not quite claimed, but undeniably present, humming beneath every glance in careful silence. They dined together in a smaller drawing room rather than the cavernous formal hall, Winifred seated between them and chattering happily about the peacocks and the fountain and the real castle she now called home, at least temporarily. Raphael watched the little girl with an expression Delphine had never expected to see on a duke's face, soft, unguarded, achingly gentle. "You're good with her," Delphine observed quietly, once Winifred had been carried off to bed by a delighted Mrs. Pemberton, exhausted from a day of unrestrained joy. "She's remarkable," Raphael said simply. "Brave enough to text a stranger in the middle of a crisis because her mother told her he was safe. That takes a particular kind of courage most adults never manage. She gets that from watching me survive things I probably shouldn't have. No." He turned to look at her fully, the candlelight softening the sharp planes of his face into something achingly sincere. "She gets that from you teaching her that even in the darkest moments, there is always someone worth reaching for. That's not survival, Delphine. That's hope. And hope is a far rarer thing to pass on to a child than mere endurance." She found herself unable to answer, throat tight with emotion she wasn't prepared to examine too closely. It was in that charged, quiet silence that the drawing-room doors burst open without warning, and Lady Cerelia strode in, flanked by two men in dark suits Delphine didn't recognize, men whose bearing suggested law enforcement rather than palace staff. "Raphael, darling," Cerelia said, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "I'm afraid we have rather urgent business to discuss. It concerns your guest. Cerelia, whatever this is, it can wait until... I'm afraid it cannot." She smiled, and it was the coldest expression Delphine had ever seen on a human face. "You see, I've done a bit of research into your Mrs. Ashworth's background. Fascinating reading, really. Particularly the part where her late husband's estate, the one she claims to have inherited, was never actually his to leave her. It seems the real heir has finally come forward." She snapped her fingers, and one of the suited men stepped forward, producing a folder of documents with grim efficiency. "Delphine Ashworth," Cerelia continued, relishing every syllable, "you are hereby being charged with fraud, forgery, and theft of a noble estate under false pretenses. These gentlemen are here to escort you to the capital for questioning, immediately." The room went utterly silent, the fire crackling loudly in the sudden stillness. Delphine felt the blood drain from her face, felt 6 years of careful, painful rebuilding crumble beneath her feet in a single devastating instant. "That's absurd," Raphael said, stepping between Delphine and the suited men with the protective instinct of a man prepared to physically block an army if necessary. "This is clearly some manufactured accusation designed to remove her from this house, Cerelia, and I will not... I'm afraid it isn't manufactured at all, Your Grace." The taller of the two men spoke for the first time, his voice grim and professional. "We have a warrant, signed by the magistrate himself this afternoon, and there is rather compelling evidence to support the charge." He held up the folder, and Delphine's stomach dropped as she recognized the documents inside, papers she had never seen before, bearing signatures that looked disturbingly like her own, detailing an inheritance scheme she had never orchestrated and could barely comprehend. "I've never seen these before in my life," she whispered, horror creeping through every word. "I don't understand. This isn't—" "Save your protests for the magistrate, Mrs. Ashworth," Cerelia said, satisfaction dripping from every syllable. "Though I do wonder, doesn't it seem rather convenient that the real heir came forward at exactly this moment? Rather like someone wanted you removed from Ravensmoor Hall before you became inconvenient." Her eyes flicked meaningfully to Raphael, and understanding crashed over Delphine like ice water. "She did this. Raphael." Delphine's voice shook, though whether from fear or fury she couldn't quite tell. "Raphael, I swear to you I have never—" "I believe you," he said immediately, firmly, his hand finding hers and gripping tight enough to anchor them both against the storm suddenly engulfing the room. "I believe you completely, and I promise you, whatever is happening here, we will unravel it together." "That's a lovely sentiment, Your Grace," the suited man said with grim finality, "but the law does not concern itself with romantic promises. Mrs. Ashworth, you'll need to come with us. Now." Delphine's eyes flew to the doorway, where Mrs. Pemberton had appeared, one hand pressed to her mouth in horror, Winifred's small silhouette visible just behind her in the hallway, having woken to the commotion and wandered down in search of her mother. "Mama?" The little girl's voice trembled through the sudden silence. "Mama, what's happening?" And as two strangers moved forward to take her by the arms, as Raphael's protests grew louder and more desperate, as Cerelia watched with cold satisfaction from the doorway, Delphine felt the fragile peace of the last 24 hours shatter completely, replaced by a terror far more insidious than anything Reginald had ever inflicted. Because this time, the danger wore silk and smiled sweetly, and she had absolutely no idea how to fight it. "Raphael," she whispered as they led her toward the door, past her daughter's terrified face, past the shattered remains of the peace she'd barely dared to hope for. "Please, please don't let them take me from her." His face was carved from granite, fury and helplessness warring in his eyes as the law, however corrupted, however manipulated, proved momentarily more powerful than even a duke's protection. "I will fix this," he said, his voice a vow carved in iron. "I swear to you, Delphine, on everything I hold sacred, I will fix this before the sun rises." But as the heavy front doors of Ravensmoor Hall closed behind her, swallowing her into the waiting darkness of an unmarked carriage, and as Winifred's sobs echoed through the halls behind them, Delphine could only pray that his vow would prove strong enough to withstand whatever game Lady Cerelia had truly set into motion. Because somewhere in the shadows of that beautiful, treacherous house, a far more dangerous secret than a fabricated fraud charge was waiting to be uncovered. A secret that would reveal exactly why Cerelia Vane wanted her gone so badly, and exactly what she was willing to destroy to keep her claim on the Duke of Ravensmoor secure. The unmarked carriage rattled through the storm-slicked streets of the capital, and Delphine sat rigid between the two silent officers, her wrists unbound but her spirit shackled by a fear she hadn't felt since the night Reginald first raised his hand against her. Somewhere behind her, fading into darkness, was her daughter's terrified face. Somewhere ahead was a magistrate, a fabricated crime, and a woman in ice-blue silk who had orchestrated all of it with surgical precision. "Think," she told herself, nails digging into her palms. "Think, Delphine, panic will not save you. It never has." She forced her mind back through every detail of the documents she'd glimpsed. The forged signatures, the mention of an estate she'd never claimed, an inheritance scheme too elaborate for a simple grudge. This wasn't merely about removing an inconvenient houseguest. This was about something far older, far larger, buried beneath years of careful silence. And then, with the clarity of a lightning strike, she remembered her late husband. Not Reginald, her first husband, Edmund Ashworth, who had died at sea 11 years ago, leaving her with nothing but his name and a modest cottage she'd scraped to keep. Edmund had spoken once, in a rare unguarded moment before his final voyage, of a half-brother he'd never met, a child born of scandal, hidden away, denied his birthright, by a family too proud to acknowledge an inconvenient truth. She had thought it a sailor's tall tale. She had been wrong. Back at Ravensmoor Hall, Raphael stood in his study, with the fury of a man who had spent his entire adult life mastering restraint, and had finally, catastrophically, lost his grip on it. Winifred sat curled in an armchair by the fire, wrapped in Mrs. Pemberton's shawl, silent tears tracking down her cheeks as she watched the Duke pace like a caged storm. "Your Grace." His solicitor, a sharp-eyed man named Mr. Thackeray, stood by the desk with the fraud documents spread before him, examining each page with a jeweler's precision. "These signatures are forgeries, competent ones, but forgeries nonetheless. See here. The pressure on the downstroke is inconsistent with genuine fatigue writing. And this seal." He tapped a wax insignia at the bottom of the final page. "This is not a magistrate's seal at all. It's a very good imitation. Can you prove it? Tonight?" "I can raise significant doubt tonight, Your Grace. Proof will take slightly longer. But there is something else you should see." Thackeray slid a final document across the desk. Older, yellowed, official. This was filed 11 years ago and buried in the estate archives. A birth record, cross-referenced against the name mentioned in the fraud complaint. The supposed true heir coming forward to claim Edmund Ashworth's estate. Raphael's eyes scanned the page, and his blood ran cold. Father, unlisted. Mother, Cerelia van, née Whitmall. The child surrendered for private fostering. She has a son, Raphael said slowly, the pieces clicking together with sickening clarity. A hidden son, and she's using this fabricated inheritance claim to remove Delphine and secure something far larger than a marriage contract. It appears so, Your Grace. If I may speculate, Lady Cerelia's family fortune has been quietly hemorrhaging for the better part of a decade. Bad investments, mounting debts hidden behind a very convincing facade. Marriage to you would solve that instantly. But if she can also install her son as legal heir to the Ashworth estate, an estate that, as it happens, borders 3 of your own family's northern territories and holds mineral rights your family has coveted for generations, she solves 2 problems with one scheme, Raphael finished grimly. Marry into power, install her son into wealth, and remove the one woman standing in the way of both. He was already moving toward the door, coat in hand, fury restored to something colder and far more purposeful than the helpless rage of an hour before. Your Grace, Thackeray called after him. Where are you going? To do what I should have done the moment they took her from this house. Raphael paused at the threshold, looking back at Winifred, who had risen from her chair, small fists clenched with a determination that mirrored her mother's exactly. I'm going to bring her home. Take me with you, Winifred said, chin lifted despite the tremor in her voice. Raphael knelt before her, his expression softening into something achingly gentle despite the fire still burning behind his eyes. I need you to be brave a little longer, he said. I need you to stay here safe, so that when your mother comes home, the very first thing she sees is you, whole and unharmed and waiting for her. Can you do that for me? Winifred nodded solemnly, and Raphael pressed a kiss to her forehead before rising and striding out into the storm once more. The magistrate's office in the capital was a cold, echoing chamber of stone and shadow, and Delphine sat on a hard wooden bench in an antechamber, exhaustion and fear warring in equal measure, as she waited for a hearing she had no idea how to survive. The 2 officers who had escorted her stood near the door, silent, unmoved by her repeated protests of innocence. She had almost given up hope of anything beyond quiet endurance when the outer doors slammed open with such force that both officers startled to attention. Raphael strode in like a man who owned the building, which, given the crest embroidered on his coat and the sheer authority radiating from every line of his posture, he very nearly did. Where is the magistrate? He said. It was not a question. Your Grace, the hearing isn't scheduled until... I did not ask about the schedule. I asked where he was. His eyes found Delphine across the chamber, and something in his expression eased fractionally at the sight of her, still whole, still unharmed. Even as fury simmered beneath the surface for everything she'd endured in the hours since he'd failed to stop her removal. Within minutes, through sheer force of title and will, Raphael had commandeered the magistrate's chambers, Thackeray at his side, with the forged documents spread across the desk like evidence in a trial already half won. The magistrate, an elderly man clearly unaccustomed to having a duke storm into his private chambers past midnight, examined the papers with growing unease as Thackeray methodically dismantled the forgery, point by damning point. This seal, the magistrate murmured, holding the document to the lamplight, is not mine. I have never issued a warrant for Mrs. Ashworth. I don't know how this reached my desk at all. Because it never should have, Raphael said. It was manufactured by someone with enough access to palace administrative channels to forge official correspondence and enough motive to want Mrs. Ashworth removed from Ravensmoor Hall by any means necessary. The magistrate's eyes flicked between the Duke's grim certainty and the document's obvious flaws, and within the hour, the charges were formally dismissed, the warrant declared void, and Delphine, pale, exhausted, but finally, blessedly free, found herself walking out into the storm-washed night with Raphael's coat draped over her shoulders and his hand gripping hers as though he intended never to let go again. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. Once they were alone in the carriage, the city lights blurring past the rain-streaked window. "I should have protected you from this. I should have seen Cerelia's desperation for what it was long before it reached this point." "You came," Delphine said, echoing words that had already become a quiet refrain between them. "That's what matters, Raphael. You came." But even as relief washed through her, even as she allowed herself to lean into the warmth of his shoulder for the first time without hesitation, a colder thought settled beneath the exhaustion. This isn't over. Cerelia will not simply accept defeat. Women like her never do. She was right. 3 days later, with the fraud charges formally dismissed and life at Ravensmoor Hall settling into something that almost resembled peace, Cerelia Vane requested, with icy, unshakable composure, a private audience with the Duke. Delphine watched from an upstairs window as the woman's carriage arrived, and something in the deliberate slowness of her approach set every nerve in Delphine's body on edge. "I know you believe you've won," Cerelia said, seated across from Raphael in his study, with the composure of a woman who had never once experienced genuine defeat. "But I would remind you, Your Grace, that your uncle the king has been waiting 3 years for our engagement to be formalized. He grows impatient, and impatience, in a man with the power to alter succession lines, is a dangerous thing indeed. Are you threatening me, Cerelia? I am informing you of political reality." She rose gracefully, smoothing her skirts. "Your uncle has made it quite clear that your continued refusal reflects poorly on the stability of this house. There are cousins, Raphael, cousins with far fewer scruples about duty and far greater enthusiasm for the throne you seem so determined to squander on sentiment." She paused at the door, delivering her final blow with surgical precision. "Marry your little widow if you must, but know that the moment you do, you forfeit any claim to the succession, and everything your family has built for generations passes instead to Edric Wolstenholme, a man who would burn half the northern territories to ash for the mineral rights beneath them. Is that truly a price you're prepared to pay for love, Your Grace? Because I promise you, she will pay it alongside you, and so will that daughter of hers." The door closed behind her with quiet, devastating finality, leaving Raphael alone with a choice that had suddenly become far more dangerous than a simple matter of the heart. Delphine found him an hour later, still seated at his desk, staring into the dying fire with an expression she hadn't seen since the night he'd carried her half-conscious into Ravensmoor Hall. "Tell me," she said simply, settling into the chair across from him. "Whatever it is, Raphael, tell me. I have survived worse than difficult truths." So he told her, the succession clause, the cousin waiting in the wings with ambitions far darker than Cerelia's petty schemes, the threat now hanging not just over his future, but over the safety of the territories and everyone within them, including, quite deliberately, Delphine and Winifred themselves. She sat in silence for a long moment after he finished, processing the enormity of what he'd just handed her. The knowledge that loving her, truly, publicly, permanently, could cost him not just a title, but the stability of an entire region, could paint targets on her back and her daughters that would never fully fade. "Then perhaps," she said slowly, each word costing her more than he could possibly know, "we shouldn't. Delphine, no, listen to me." She stood, pacing before the fire, arms wrapped around herself as though holding herself together by sheer will. "I have spent 6 years believing that love was a luxury people like me couldn't afford, that every time I reached for something good, it would be twisted into a weapon against the people I love most. I watched Reginald nearly kill me. I watched a woman I'd never harmed try to have me imprisoned on fabricated charges. And now you're telling me that if I stay, if this becomes real, an entire region could suffer for it. Delphine, look at me." He crossed the room and took her hands, forcing her to meet his eyes. "I am not interested in a crown that requires me to abandon the one person who has ever made me feel like more than a title. Let Edric have the succession if it comes to that. Let my uncle rage. I have spent 6 years being dutiful, being careful, being everything this family demanded of me, and it brought me nothing but loneliness. I would rather be a disgraced nobleman who loves you freely than a powerful duke who lets you walk away out of fear. And if it isn't only your happiness at stake," her voice cracked, "if Edric truly is as dangerous as Cerelia claims, if the northern territories suffer, if innocent people pay the price for our choice, then we find another way." His grip on her hands tightened, grounding, certain. "We do not simply surrender to threats designed to frighten us into submission, Delphine. That is exactly what Cerelia wants, to make us believe our only options are her engagement or catastrophe. I refuse to believe that is true, and I refuse to let fear write the ending to this story before we've even finished writing the beginning." For a long moment, they simply stood there, foreheads nearly touching, the fire crackling low behind them. 6 years of carefully buried longing finally, fully unleashed between them. "I'm terrified," Delphine whispered. "So am I," Raphael admitted. "But I would rather be terrified with you than safe without you, if that makes any sense at all. It makes more sense than anything has in years," she breathed. And when he finally, carefully closed the distance between them, when his lips brushed hers with a tenderness that spoke of 6 years of restraint finally released, the fire, the storm outside, the looming threats of succession and scandal, all seemed to fade into something distant and unimportant, compared to the quiet, overwhelming certainty of finally coming home. The solution, when it finally arrived, came not from politics or force, but from an unexpected source entirely. 2 weeks later, summoned to a private audience with the king himself, Raphael arrived at the palace prepared for battle, Thackeray at his side, with a folder of research the solicitor had spent every waking hour compiling. What he hadn't expected was to find Delphine already waiting in the antechamber, summoned separately, her expression a careful mixture of nerves and steel. "You didn't need to come," he murmured. "I did, actually," she said. "Because I've spent my entire adult life being talked about instead of talked to. I'm done with that." The king, a stern, silver-haired man whose resemblance to Raphael was unmistakable in the set of his jaw, regarded them both with an expression that gave away nothing as they were finally admitted into his chambers. "I've heard a great deal about you, Mrs. Ashworth," he said without preamble. "Fraud charges, scandal, a duke abandoning state functions to chase after you through storms. Tell me why I shouldn't simply agree with Lady Cerelia that you represent instability my family cannot afford." Delphine, rather than shrinking beneath the weight of royal scrutiny, stepped forward with quiet, unshaken dignity. "Because Lady Cerelia manufactured those charges herself, Your Majesty. To protect a scheme built on forged documents and a hidden son she's attempting to install as heir to an estate that isn't rightfully his. Because the only instability in this situation was created by people desperate to secure power through manipulation rather than earn it through honesty. And because I have spent 3 years surviving a violent marriage, and 6 years watching your nephew deny himself happiness out of duty to a family that has never once, as far as I can tell, prioritized his well-being over its own convenience." The king's expression remained unreadable for a long, tense moment. Then, unexpectedly, something that might have been the ghost of a smile flickered at the corner of his mouth. "Well," he said, "at least one of you has the courage to speak plainly in this family." He gestured to Thackeray's folder. "I assume that contains proof of everything you've just claimed?" "It does, Your Majesty," Thackeray said, stepping forward immediately. What followed was a careful, methodical unraveling of Cerelia's scheme, the forged documents, the hidden son, the mounting debts she'd concealed for years beneath a facade of aristocratic composure. By the time Thackeray finished, the king's expression had shifted from skepticism to something considerably colder, directed no longer at Delphine, but at the woman who had nearly succeeded in manipulating his own family's succession for her private gain. "Lady Cerelia's family," the king said finally, "will find their standing at court considerably diminished after this discovery becomes known. As for the succession clause," he waved a dismissive hand, "it was drafted to prevent frivolous, politically destabilizing marriages, Raphael, not to punish you for choosing a woman of genuine character over one of manufactured pedigree. I will have it fixed by week's weekend." Raphael's shoulders, tense for weeks beneath the weight of impossible choices, finally eased. "Thank you, uncle." "Don't thank me." The king's eyes flicked to Delphine, something almost approving in his gaze. "Thank the woman who apparently has more backbone than half my court combined. Now get out of my chambers, both of you, before I remember I'm supposed to maintain some semblance of royal dignity." Cerelia Vane's downfall, once set into motion, unfolded with the swift, merciless efficiency of aristocratic scandal, whispered first in ballrooms, then shouted across newspaper headlines, until the woman who had once commanded rooms with icy confidence found herself instead the subject of exactly the kind of ruin she had tried to orchestrate for someone else. Her hidden son's claim to the Ashworth estate was formally dismissed, her family's mounting debts exposed for all of society to dissect, and within a month, she had quietly departed the capital altogether, her ambitions reduced to ash by the very schemes she'd woven to secure them. Reginald Cross, facing his own reckoning after Thackeray's investigation uncovered a pattern of violence stretching back years before Delphine had ever met him, was formally stripped of what remained of his social standing and quietly imprisoned for charges that had, at long last, caught up with him. And at Ravensmoor Hall, beneath a sky finally clear of storms, something quieter and infinitely more beautiful began to bloom. The wedding, when it finally arrived on a golden autumn afternoon 6 months later, was smaller than palace tradition typically demanded, a deliberate choice made jointly, to honor the quiet intimacy of a love built not from politics, but from a rain-soaked rescue and a little girl's desperate courage. Winifred, dressed in pale blue silk and beaming with unrestrained joy, walked ahead of her mother down the garden aisle scattering rose petals with the solemn seriousness only a 6-year-old could muster for such an important task. Delphine followed in a gown far simpler than aristocratic expectation demanded, her only jewelry a small locket containing a photograph of the daughter who had, quite literally, saved both their lives with a single desperate text message. Raphael waited at the end of the aisle beneath the same archway of white blossoms where he'd first confessed 6 years of buried longing, his expression stripped of every ounce of ducal composure, replaced entirely by open, unguarded joy. "You came," he whispered, echoing words that had become theirs alone, as she finally reached him. "I will always come," she whispered back, smiling through tears, "every single time." As the ceremony concluded and the assembled guests rose in applause, Winifred rushed forward, wrapping her small arms around both of them at once, and Raphael lifted her easily into the embrace, the three of them standing together beneath the blossoms as though they had always belonged exactly there. Later, as the celebration continued beneath strings of golden lights in the garden where it had all truly begun, Raphael found a quiet moment alone with his new stepdaughter, kneeling before her with the same gentle solemnity he'd shown her that very first terrifying night. "You saved us, you know," he said softly. "That text you sent, that took more courage than most adults manage in a lifetime." Winifred considered this with the serious thoughtfulness of a child who had already learned, far too young, how heavy the world could be. "Mama always said," she said finally, "that even in the scariest moments, you should reach for the person who makes you feel safe. So I did." Raphael felt something in his chest crack open with tenderness far too large to contain. "Then I promise you," he said, "for as long as I live, I will always, always be that person for both of you, no matter what storms come." Across the garden, watching her husband and daughter with tears of pure, overwhelming joy, Delphine allowed herself, at long last, to believe that the darkest chapter of her life had finally, truly closed, replaced by a love story that had begun not with grand romantic gestures, but with the simple, desperate courage of a little girl who refused to let fear silence her voice. Sometimes the story reminded anyone watching closely enough, the bravest act in the world is simply reaching out, for help, for safety, for love, even when every instinct screams to stay silent. Sometimes that single act of courage is enough to change everything. Thank you for staying with this story until the very end. If Delphine and Raphael's journey moved you, if Winifred's courage reminded you of the quiet bravery it takes to reach out when the world feels darkest, we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Which moment stayed with you the most? If you enjoyed this story, please consider giving it a like and subscribing to the Royal Duke Diaries for more tales of royal romance, hidden courage, and love that refuses to be silenced. Your support means the world to us and helps these stories reach others who need them. Until next time, may you always find the courage to reach for the hand that keeps you safe.